So it's been about 6 months now since we put together our ultimate gaming PC. Now at the time, this was a absolutely no expense spared, top of the line, pretty much best you could buy of everything build, and it ended up costing me about $7,500 Australian to put this together. And it's served me really well. It's done everything that I've needed it to do and more, and I've been absolutely thrilled and happy with it. No complaints whatsoever. Now I've recently been having a few chats with some of the guys from HP who asked me if I would be interested in taking a look at one of their OMEN desktops, which is actually quite equivalently spec'd to this machine, but a hell of a lot cheaper. So what we have here today to take a look at is HP's brand new OMEN desktop machine. Now I'll take you through the specs of it in just a moment, but what you need to know straight off the bat here is that this is pretty equivalently spec'd to this machine here. The only real difference being that this is running a 9700K rather than the 9900K, which is in this machine. And a lot of people would actually argue that the 9700K is better value for gaming anyway, because you're able to reach slightly higher clock speeds. But the interesting thing here is that this machine retails for $3,799 Australian. $7,500 here. So what we're going to do today is take a look at the hardware inside the OMEN desktop in a little bit more detail, as well as compare it performance-wise through some benchmarks, as well as some games as well to my ultimate gaming PC, and basically find out whether I completely wasted my money building this machine and whether a system like this can actually give you decent value for money. We'll also have a look at what you could build yourself for around the same price as this as well. And yeah, it should be really interesting. So let's get stuck into it. So we'll begin by going through all the tech specs quickly for you so you know exactly what we're dealing with here. So I've got my cheat notes in front of me here on my laptop. So this model is the OMEN by HP Obelisk Desktop 875-1140A. So we've got the Intel Core i7-9700K, which is their 9th generation i7 processor. 8 cores with turbo boost up to 4.9 gigahertz. And we should be able to overclock that a little bit, I think, but we'll check that out later. That is going to be dependent on the cooling that we have inside as well. And obviously we'll take a look at that in more detail too. We've got Windows 10 Home 64 installed, or pre-installed rather. We have two 16 gig sticks, so 32 gig of HyperX DDR4 2666 megahertz RAM. Now, not sure whether we're going to be able to overclock that yet or not, but that'll be something interesting to check out a little bit later on. We have a 512 gigabyte PCIe NVMe TLC M.2 SSD drive in there. That is a mouthful. Now, in addition to that, we also have a 2 terabyte 7200 RPM SATA drive as well, so plenty of storage on board. Now, lastly, you guys probably would have already noticed the RTX logo there, so we're running a full-blown 11 gigabyte RTX 2080 Ti graphics card as well. So, in terms of specs, at least on paper, this thing certainly seems to deliver the goods. So, let's take his clothes off now and have a closer look at exactly what we have inside. Now, one of the things that impresses me straight away about this is the case design. Very compact, no sharp edges anywhere, very, very finely machined, and all very well put together. Now, there's this little button on the back here that you press for internal access. Simply press the button, the top comes undone, and we can take the side panel off. You can see we've got the OMEN little logo there, and that does feature in a few other places on the case as well, but we'll look at that in more detail once we've had a look at the guts of the thing. So internally we have our CPU there. Now we've got a OMEN branded CPU cooler as well, which looks really nice. I don't know who actually manufactures that. I'm assuming that HP don't make it themselves, but I have asked them, and hopefully I'll get an answer before we finish this video, so I'll be able to tidy it up at the end. Otherwise we'll cover it later on. But yeah, a little all-in-one system there with the OMEN logo on it, really clean. It's got proprietary screw heads on there. Looks like Torx screws to screw down the CPU cooler. So obviously they don't want just anybody taking the cooler off, and that's fine for a system like this. Obviously warranty is a very important thing as well, so obviously they want to try and keep prying fingers out of it as much as possible. Now, one of the really cool things about pre-made and custom designed systems that are all designed to work together is that all the lines and cables and things like that are all the right length to fit where they need to go without too much clutter, and that's certainly the case with the CPU cooler here as well. So we've got a single 120mm radiator up the top here, and it will be really interesting to see how well that performs for a 9700K, because my gut feeling is that it's probably not adequate to cool this thing, at least if we're overclocking it quite heavily. So we've got two short little red braided lines that run up to the radiator there, 120mm fan on it as well. So we've got a 2 terabyte SATA drive sitting up in the bay here. We've got a spare bay there for expandability as well, should you want to add something later. We've got an additional SATA port on the motherboard as well. We'll talk about expandability in just a moment as well, because that is something that I think needs to be covered in detail for this motherboard specifically. 2 RAM slots there with an additional 2 which are unpopulated currently, so we could run more RAM if we wanted to. We've got a M2 SSD drive there, which you can see installed. That's our 512GB that we talked about before. A second slot underneath this little cover as well. Now, it is a plastic cover, so it's not a heatsink, so to speak, which is the reason why the primary is installed there with no heatsink as well. Now, we've got a single PCI Express port here, which is populated by our RTX 2080 Ti graphics card. There's no expandability there, so you can't add a second graphics card if you wanted to. You'd be limited by the power as well. We've only got an 800 watt power supply in here, which is perfectly adequate for the hardware that's in here. But if you were later on wanting to upgrade the graphics card to something more power hungry or upgrade the CPU, then you definitely would need to think about upgrading the power supply as well. All the key fundamentals are all there. Let's have a look at the motherboard in a little bit more detail now. So you've probably figured this out already, but it is a micro ATX motherboard, so a little bit shorter than you might be used to seeing in a full-size desktop machine. But everything that we need is crammed in there. We'll talk a little bit about inputs and outputs on the motherboard itself now. So we've got an additional SATA port there, obviously for an additional drive. We've got our USB 3 connector here to run to our inputs and outputs on the top of the case, which we'll look at a little bit later on. We've got our light bar extension there, which looks to be just a standard USB internal connection, which runs down to a little module down the bottom here to control all of our lighting. We've got our power button and our LED for our power light. We've got our liquid cooler pump header. We've got a system fan. We've got a system fan there as well. We've got our CPU power, so the 2 power phases there running up to the CPU. We've got, what else do we have? Another audio connection down the bottom here, our standard ATX connector there. We've got a little wireless module there, which is plugged in. So the motherboard does have wireless capability, which is nice. Our 2 M2 slots that we saw before. So one there, one there. And then in terms of other inputs and outputs on the back here, we have an optical output. We've got a USB-C connection as well, Ethernet, and then we've got a microphone jack, a line level output, and a line level input as well. So not a massive amount of inputs and outputs on the back there. So it's interesting to see that it doesn't have any provision for surround sound. Not something that you see very often on motherboards these days. And then on the graphics card, we have a USB-C connection, 3 display ports, and an HDMI port. So not quite as much expandability on the motherboard as I'm used to seeing. We don't have things like additional fan headers, temperature probes. We don't have things like a dual BIOS or flashback mode or anything like that I can see. No headers for anything like that. But look, everything that needs to be there is there, and I don't see any of that stuff really impacting performance. But just a couple of things to point out there, which are a little bit different from what you might be used to seeing on your ASRock, Asus, and say Gigabyte motherboards, for examples. Now, another thing that I have to mention just while we're looking inside here is the cable management is absolutely fantastic. With the exception of the wiring that runs up to the graphics card here, which is a little bit messy. It would be nice to see braided red cables like we've got here for a little bit more consistency. But yeah, and it's not over the top, and you don't really see that too much when the front panel's on. But seeing as it is a mirrorized glass panel, I'll just chuck that back on for you quickly now so you can see when that's on. You can kind of see that wiring down there. So it would definitely have been nice if they'd included braided cables for the PCI Express external power, but not a big deal, nothing to really whinge about, just an observation there. But other than the bit of cable spaghetti that we have running from the power supply, everything else is very tidy. All the cables are tucked away nicely. There's little retention clips for pretty much everything built into the case, so there's no cable ties sort of securing things. Or the only cable ties I can see are just sort of bunching up the wires in a few places. So very, very well laid out. There's no restriction to airflow or anything like that I can see. Now, interestingly, there's no additional fans in the case. So we've got the one fan for the all-in-one cooler, which blows out the top. So that's pushing through and out the top of the case. Then we have obviously our blower fan inside our graphics card as well. There's a fan in the power supply as well down the bottom that I can see, 120mm fan there. And then we have one additional 90mm fan at the back here for ventilation. So again, that's pushing out through the back of the case. But there's no inlet fans anywhere. I don't, again, see that being a problem. There is ventilation in the bottom of the case where it can come up through, and there is a little filter there as well that you can remove. So that's nice. So that sits in there. But yeah, again, I don't really see ventilation being an issue. There's plenty of airflow in through the graphics card. It's able to draw air in through there, blow it out the back, as all graphics cards do these days. And it does look like there should be enough airflow through the case that we're able to draw air in through the 2 fans here as well. Now, while we're on the subject of cooling as well, you can see some aluminium heat sinks on our VRMs here for the CPU. Now, they do look a little bit smaller than what you might be used to seeing on a lot of motherboards, but admittedly, a lot of motherboards these days add a lot of plastic and a lot of clutter on top of the actual heat sinks to make it look like they're a lot bigger than they actually are. So that's not necessarily a problem either. But again, we'll have a look at the overclocking performance a little bit later on to ascertain whether there is additional cooling required or whether what's there is sufficient for what we can achieve out of this CPU. So anyway, let's move on into some performance stuff now. So let's dive straight into this performance stuff here. So we have this little program here called OMEN Command Center. Now, if you remember back to my review of the Alienware M15R2 laptop, their inbuilt software, the control center software, was absolutely horrendously badly made. It was crashing all the time, took hours and hours to get installing. I'm happy to report that this software is straightforward and simple to use. There is one pretty big problem with it though that I'll cover in just a moment, but very simple to use. You've got a screen here that says System Vitals. So you've got your GPU utilization here, 30% load and 36 degrees currently. We've got our CPU utilization, our percentage and temperature as well, and our memory utilization too. So all pretty straightforward. We've got our download and upload speed there for those who might be interested in watching that. Then we move down, we've got a couple of different options here. We'll skip over overclocking just for now. We'll come back to that in just a moment. We've got our lighting options. So we can change our colors here for the logo on the front of the tower, as well as the LED strip at the top of the tower. We've got animation options here as well, so we can set up all sorts of different effects. Pretty cool. All the basic stuff you would find in any sort of RGB software here. You can adjust the speed, fast and slow as well, and you can adjust independently for the internal lighting as well as the front of the case. So nothing groundbreaking there, but all good stuff to have. Now you also have the option for the lighting on the graphics card as well. So we've got the cross pattern, which you can't really see in this case with it standing on its side anyway. But again, you've got all the different effects there. You can see going through, so we can have an audio pulse that goes in time with your music, you know, all the usual RGB stuff that you would expect. So then we have this game stream mode, which we're not going to look at now. We'll go into this in another video separately. I think it probably warrants its own video, but this allows us to stream the gameplay to another device, an Android phone or another PC in the house. So say you've got your gaming desktop in your office or your gaming room and you want to play something with your controller on your TV, you can do that with another device. So we'll check that out in another video. We've got My Games here, which is just the games that we've got installed. I'm not going to sign into the profile now, so we're not going to look at that. Again, we can cover that in another video. We'll skip over coaching as well because that's not really relevant to the performance of the machine. Again, we'll cover that in another video, but that's things like a sonic radar that shows where your positions of the enemies are based on the sound, you know, stuff like that. So we'll go back to OMEN Desktop here again and click down to our overclocking panel. So at default settings, we're running at a core multiplier of 46 times on all cores, and obviously that scales depending on how many cores are active. You've got your cache ratio as well, which you normally can get away with up to about 300 megahertz less than what your core multiplier is. So if you're overclocking to 5 gigahertz, you'd set that to 46 or 47 maybe if you could get away with it. And then we've got our core voltage offset here as well. So we'll go over the system performance and some benchmarks at the default speeds as well as my final overclocking settings in just a moment. But first I wanted to talk about the intelligent overclocking mode here as well as the process for custom overclocking. So I clicked on the intelligent mode earlier on and ran through this process, and it takes about 40 minutes. It reboots into some sort of a lockdown BIOS mode that runs through a bunch of tests to sort of determine what the safe voltages and clock speeds are for the system. And it seemed to all work well and good. And then I went into my benchmarking software and found that my clock speed had ramped all the way up to 5.1 gigahertz, which was fine, but my voltage was sitting at a massive 1.6 volts on the vCore, which is absolutely ridiculously high. Now, I've never come across an automatic overclocking tool that I've trusted on any motherboard in the past, really ever, so it didn't really surprise me all that much, but 1.6 volts is massively too high for the 9700K. You should never run more than about 1.4, 1.45 volts at an absolute maximum for a daily use computer. And that's even with custom water cooling, you know, multiple radiators and, you know, those sorts of things with the temperatures under control. But 1.6 volts on a 120 millimeter radiator like this is frankly just ridiculous. And I've actually emailed HP and said, look guys, you need to do something about this because that's just crazy. That's going to damage people's computers. So what happened in the real world is as soon as I ran a benchmark, it just thermal throttled immediately, which I expected, got straight up to 100 degrees. But the more concerning thing was when I went back down to default again, those voltages stayed. So I brought the clock speed back down to the 4.6 gigahertz that we were expecting, but the voltage stayed up at around that 1.6 volts on the vCore. So we were still overvolting, we were still overheating and still running into thermal throttling, even when we clicked on that default button again. Now I did try rebooting. I tried, restoring the BIOS back to factory defaults as well. That didn't work. I actually ended up having to reflash the BIOS using the inbuilt backup on the system to restore it back to the stock voltages of around 1.35 volts at default, which ended up working in the end. But I feel like I was very lucky that I caught this before it damaged the CPU. And for somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, if they just go in here and they click on intelligent overclock and end up doing that, there's a very good chance that you could end up damaging your system, even with the built-in thermal protection, simply because the voltage is so far beyond what you should be running for this CPU. So I would definitely recommend, please do not click on that intelligent button. Please do not use the auto overclocking mode. At least at the time of making this video, that appears to be quite broken. Now, I will give you guys an update later on if and when HP fix this. I have emailed them this morning to let them know that there's an issue there, so hopefully they'll fix that up soon. But if we go into custom here, you can see we have pretty limited functionality here, but we've got everything that we need fundamentally. We've got a core multiplier adjustment, a cache ratio adjustment, as well as an offset. So in the end, after a bunch of testing, I was able to get up to 5.1 gigahertz at a stretch. I had to run it a little bit warmer than I liked to get to that clock speed. So I'm going to run this at 5 gigahertz for daily use. I was able to get my cache ratio up to 47. Now with those settings, using the SVID table that's built into the CPU, the motherboard was automatically running it up at around about 1.45 volts on the vCore, which again is still too much for daily use for a radiator of this size. So what I ended up doing was ramping that down by 100 millivolts to minus 100 millivolts there on the offset. So there we go, 1.1, that's fine. Hitting apply, and that gave us a nice clean sort of 1.35 volts, which I was comfortable with. And we saw temperatures at around about the 85 degree mark at a maximum after about an hour of stress testing. So I'm quite comfortable with that. I'm happy with that. So that's what we ended up running. And I'll just quickly show you on the screen here as well what that looks like when it's running. So we'll open up our stability test here, as well as our CPU ID. We'll hit start. And you can see here, we've got 1.35-ish volts on the vCore. And then over here, we're running at around about 75 degrees at the moment. Obviously, it's cool at the moment because it's only just started. After about an hour, it started to peak out at about 85 degrees on all cores. So nice and stable. It seems to be all fine. Haven't run into any issues so far. Obviously, everybody's results are going to be different when it comes to overclocking. But yeah, for a 9700K, 5 gigahertz, 5.1 gigahertz is pretty respectable. Sometimes you can get up to about 5.2, 5.3 gigahertz with a nice custom loop that keeps those temperatures down, allows you to run a bit more voltage. But again, for a 120 millimeter radiator like this, I'm pretty happy with 5 gigahertz on all cores. I think that is pretty darn respectable. So let's get into some benchmarking results now. So how many of you guys were surprised at just how close this system came to this system in the results? I've never done a back-to-back test with a off-the-shelf type system like this compared to one of my builds before. And I've got to admit that I feel a little bit silly now for having spent so much money building this machine. What it boiled down to in the end, just having a look at the results here, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider with RTX on and off, both times this machine was 10% faster than this machine was in terms of our average frame rate. Hitman 2, 11% faster. F1 2019, we were also 11% faster. 3D Mark Time Spy final result, 21% faster. That's also accounting for the differences in CPUs as well there. Remember, this is a 9700K, this is a 9900K. Then in Unigen, we were 14% faster on this side, and Basemark GPU, we were 10% faster on this side. Now, what I can tell you from using the two systems in the real world, benchmarks aside, is that when you're gaming on a relatively small monitor, so say 1440p or something like that, there really is no discernible difference between the two systems. It's not until you really start to push the upper limits that you really start to see the benefits in a machine like this. So I don't regret building this. I feel a little bit silly maybe for spending quite so much money on it, but you know, double the price for 10 to 15% more performance in the real world. You really got to kind of weigh up at that point whether it is worth investing in something like this for your particular usage case. Now for me personally, because I am running this machine at the ragged edge most of the time, I'm running massive resolutions across my triple monitors. I'm trying to record at the same time as well. You know, I really do need all of the processing power that I can possibly get my hands upon. But I've got to say, for the majority of people, the argument for a system more similar to this one is certainly a lot stronger than the argument for a system like this. And I've certainly received my fair share of abuse on the internet for spending so much money on this guy. Now, a big part of it as well is, you know, being an enthusiast and actually enjoying the process of creating something like this. I enjoy all the water cooling. I enjoy doing the overclocking. I enjoy, you know, pushing numbers to the ragged edge and seeing exactly what I can achieve. And there's value in spending that money for me there as well. But if you're just wanting something off the shelf that does a really darn good job at gaming, then something like this is a really fantastic option. Now, the other big question that I promised I would answer at the start of this video is, how does a system like this compare to something that you could build yourself of equivalent specifications? So I quickly priced up a couple of different systems on a few different platforms, PC Case Gear, MLN, a couple of different sites like that we have here in Australia, and found that I could build myself one for about $100 to $200 cheaper than what this costs off the shelf. Now, it's worth noting there that that does include a Windows 10 Home license as well, which is around about 150 Australian dollars. You can pick up licenses a lot cheaper from a few places online. I'm not going to get into that though, but yeah, so maybe say $200 to maybe $300 cheaper to build something yourself compared to buying something like this off the shelf. But then you have the added advantage of all the software's there, everything that you need is just there. And honestly, this was up and running within, you know, 5 to 10 minutes of unboxing it. Everything was installed and we were good to go. So it really comes down to where you place your value. But if you're the sort of person that enjoys doing these sorts of things yourself, then you might find better value in building something yourself of equivalent specification. Now, the only other thing that I do need to highlight there as well is that the overclocking functionality, as you saw earlier in the video, is quite limited on this machine. We don't have the ability, at least as it stands right now, to go in through the BIOS and adjust voltages and clock speeds, core frequencies, core ratios, and all those things manually. There's no load line calibration adjustment, anything like that. Literally what you saw in the OMEN software is all I had to work with overclocking. So if that's important to you as well, then that's another reason why you might want to look at building your own system with a more mainstream motherboard. But again, you've got to bring it back to the numbers and consider that, you know, even with the limitations that we had here in terms of overclocking, we were still able to get within 10% of the performance, 10 to 15% of the performance of this machine. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully that's given you a better idea of what kind of value you get out of building a crazy high-end system like this and how it compares to something more like this off the shelf. So this is the HP OMEN 875-1140A model. I've put a link in the description below where you can pick up more information about this particular model. But that's it for today's video, guys. Hopefully you found this useful. I'm going to now move on to doing some more PC related videos. We've got a bunch of stuff happening this week. I'm going to do a complete rebuild of my editing and streaming machine, which has been about 2 years now since we put that together. So we're going to be doing a coolant flush. We're going to be cleaning it all up, showing you how to do that, showing you how to clean water blocks, installing some fresh new gear into that as well. But I hope you guys have found this insightful and interesting. If you have, please make sure you leave a thumbs up. Make sure you're subbed and hit the notification bell too so you don't miss future videos. If you want to help support the channel, we do have some links in the description below. We have our membership program. You can hit the join button to check that out. We also have our Patreon as well. We're going to be focusing a little bit more heavily on that over the next couple of weeks as well, trying to get a little bit more traction there. But that is it for today, guys. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.